In each episode, Dr. Blackman and Dr. Lewis will tackle a different area of interest for transforming Guyana.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to Transforming Guyana, Season 3, Episode 8. Yes, we're Season 3, Episode 8. And today we want to talk about navigating economic growth, policy, and development. And in particular, we want to discuss the economic challenges in the early 21st century Guyana and Guyana's, broadly speaking, post-independence growth and development. I am Dr. Terrence Blackman, Chair and Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York, and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. As always, I take an opportunity to say something. At the Guyana Business Journal, our mission is really to foster a critical dialogue, thought leadership that contributes to securing an open, prosperous, inclusive Guyana, one where all Guyanese, regardless of race, class, or background, can share equitably in the nation's economic future. And the purpose of these Transforming Guyana webinars now I just seem to have lost you for a brief moment, to sort of engage experts, thought leaders from Guyana and the diaspora to discuss the impacts of Guyana's economic transformation, explore policies and strategies to ensure our economic growth that translates into broad-based sustainable development. So today's conversation will focus on Guyana's post-independence economic trajectory and the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. And we're delighted, absolutely delighted, to feature the editors of this newly released book, Economic Challenges in Early 21st Century Guyana, Post-Independence Growth and Development, Dr. Dianna DaSilva-Glasgow, Dr. Tarron Khemraj, and Dr. Desmond Thomas. And together, we will sort of broadly explore the evolution of since independence and identify some of the policy shifts and the critical challenges facing Guyana's economy today and sort of some potential pathways forward. That's the broad overview. I wanted to, as I was sharing with Tarron earlier, one of the reasons that I thought this was a really wonderful initiative, a wonderful effort. So a few months ago, I was asked to comment on Guyana's economic history. And after doing a bit of research, I found there was nothing where the economic history of Guyana was sort of laid out in a nice narrative, collected, collated, whatever. It was here and there in pieces, isolated in various places. And I also thought that one of the things that, as Guyanese, we, as a culture, there is an economic identity. And I think not having plumbed these depths of what our trajectory has been means somehow that we have not really familiarized ourselves with our identity economically, and to really be able to understand our tendencies and ways in which we might be able to better manage ourselves so as to take advantage and to leverage this wealth opportunity that is presented to us. So I just wanted to kind of give my quick sense of, here is what I hope our conversation could be about, and then I'll ask the experts, the real experts, to comment on this. So, I've decided to very clearly remove all of the extraneous details. So here's what I view as a rough outline of Guyana's economic history. So this is to set the stage for for colleagues. So the broad thing is to think, well, how has Guyana gone from our post-independence struggles to being what the IMF recently characterized as one of the world's fastest growing economies? Well, post-independence economy, we relied on sugar, rice, bauxite, and perhaps I think our biggest economic decision post-independence was the adoption of the cooperative socialism in the 1970s, where we nationalized our industries. Now, I'm not going to. I'm hoping that you will tell us something more about this, but I will simply conclude that the hope for economic gains did not materialize, leading to a kind of economic stagnation. What followed? So many of us who are of a certain age, we lived through this. The GDP declined by about 3% annually during the 80s. External debt surge, severe balance of payment crisis. And then the next big step, I think, in our economic trajectory was the economic recovery program. There are many details that I'm leaving out here, but I'm leaving this for you to fill in as you deem appropriate. Was the economic recovery program, the IMF-backed economic recovery program, which then set us on the trajectory to market liberalization, privatization, and then GDP growth of around about 6% between 1991 and 1997, the kinds of structural reforms that improved kind of macroeconomic stability. But even in this moment, there are still, really sort of structural weaknesses, heavy dependence on commodities. We remember the moment of gold. There are still large infrastructure gaps, electricity, transportation. We're still experiencing blackouts. Our transportation infrastructure is still not what it ought to be. Our water management infrastructure is still not what it ought to be. And most importantly, the sort of persistent human capital flight, which certainly has weakened our workforce, which, folks might often refer to as brain drain. But this is part of the broad structural weakness in our economic story. We then come to 2015. And then in 2015, we have the discovery of these vast offshore oil reserves. And Guyana's GDP growth hits a whopping number of 62%, if I have this right, in 2022, the world's highest. Oil production gets up to more than 350,000 barrels per day. I think we're looking in 2027, 2028 at oil production, getting close to 1 million barrels per day. And so in a quick nutshell, that's the story that I think I want to kind of leave as the trend line for our conversation. Now, what's the challenge? How do we manage this? Well, how do we avoid this research curse that we've seen in other oil-rich nations? How do we establish, as has been recently in the press, really transparent national resource fund management? And I think the really difficult question for folks like you who think on these matters, how do we ensure that these revenues benefit all of Guyana and not just our elites? And what are some of our pathways to sustainability? Diversifying the economy between oil and gas, better investments in education, technology, infrastructure, strengthening the institutions, ensuring transparent governance. I think all of these things lie in the sort of domain of the work that you've done. And so, I want you to begin to tell us, here's what the history looks like, and here's what we think should be what's next for Guyana. How do we ensure that these economic growth benefits all Guyanese, and what sort of policies and strategies will or ought to shape our future? I'm always very bad about this, so I thought I'd put this in the early slide. So I went to say, for the folks who have been supportive of the program in some tangible ways. Some of you might know some of the people on this list: Tony Harris, Michelle Leward, Nolan Bradshaw, my graduate school colleague, Sean McDonald, my student, Barbara Roberts, Courtney Allen, and others. I tend to do the program, get excited about whatever people say, and never say thanks. So I wanted to say thank you at the very beginning as my way of transitioning to you, the speakers. So I perhaps wanted to start with you, Dr. DaSilva-Glasgow. I have your bio, and I don't want to read it. I want to maybe give you a sense to, take 2 minutes to, tell us who you are and just about limited your contributions. Then you'll come back and say something in a much larger sense. So, Dr. DaSilva-Glasgow.
Good morning, Dr. Blackman, and good morning to all our listening audience. My name, of course, Dianna DaSilva-Glasgow. I've been an academic for over 12 years. I took breaks at different periods of time, but I've been attached to the University of Guyana for at least 12 years now. I'm an economist by training, with specialization in international trade policy and economic development policy. I've written academically on matters related to trade and wider development. I'm currently working with the Department of Economics and providing administrative leadership support to the Faculty of Social Sciences as Dean. So I'm able to also draw from other fields in the social sciences in my development work. So I've done some work on social development policy, looking at matters related to vulnerable subgroups, disabilities, inclusion of vulnerable subgroups in society. I'm happy to be here, happy to share whatever insight I could to the topic being considered and to support my colleagues as we discuss this very important publication that we have together collaborated on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Khemraj.
Yes, so I'm a student from the University of Guyana. I attended UG from 1992 to 1996. I worked at the Bank of Guyana after that, and then went on to do graduate studies in England and in the US, and I'm now teaching in Florida. I've written a lot about these topics from monetary and growth and development standpoint. And so you could find my academic work, and I have two types of academic work, some that are really, really pitched for my colleagues to only to read, where we use all the math and so on. And then I have several papers that are, I think, that are general audience. You could find those on ResearchGate. And some of them you'll see on my Google account. I would urge you to read them. You've written a lot about Guyana and similar economies. If you really check, I think you'll be able to find a Stabrook News page where I've documented a lot of my ideas on these questions, and I will get into the history later on, as Dr. Blackman asked. But yeah, I mean, I've written a lot of academic work in Guyana, and I urge you to read them. They're out there. And when we write academic stuff, we generally focus on principles, right? And the principles should be applicable for a long time. So even if a paper is written 20 years ago, it's the principle. You, the reader, have to tell us, do you think the principle still applies today? Yes, you may find some of the data used or data presented might be old, but I think the principles still matter. So I will stop there. You can just find a lot of my stuff online.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Khemraj. Well, I'll come back to this. So we were having a chat earlier about the important impact of the University of Guyana, and I think already 50% of the panel has some contact in some substantive way with the University of Guyana. And suppose I can make it 75%. So I should note that even though I have not been a student at the University of Guyana, my mother, who was the first university graduate in our family, graduated from the University of Guyana. So we're 75% on this panel that owes their livelihood to the University of Guyana. Dr. Desmond Thomas, tell us about your relationship to the University of Guyana. Give us just a little thought in this regard.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dr. Blackman. First of all, thanks for giving us the opportunity to highlight this book, because, of course, it's important for it to have impact outside of the university environment. So I'm also, I think you should raise your percentage to 100%. I myself an economist, and I'm a proud alum of the University of Guyana and some other universities. In terms of a career, I started I taught at the University of West Indies, the Mona campus, for 10 years. And I've since taught at some other universities, brief periods at the University of Trent in Canada, the Florida International University. And I'm happy to maintain, now that I'm back in Guyana, I'm happy to maintain an engagement with the University of Guyana and to make myself available to support the university in any way I can. I spent a year as acting economic advisor to President Burnham back in the 80s. I started my career, so to speak, as an economist, as a statistician at the CARICOM Secretariat. And I kind of ended my working career at the Inter-American Development Bank, ended as a lead economics specialist in the Caribbean department. So that's my career. And to make a general point, since I've been back, I've retired from those jobs, but I'm not retired from economics or from the interest of what's going on in Guyana. And I've been motivated by a simple question. And that is, why is it that in spite of Guyana's undoubted endowments, its human endowments, its natural resource endowments, why is it that despite all of that, our people are so poor? And in so many ways, Guyana remains so backward. And that is what has focused my attention over the last 10 years or so. In a sense, that connects with my general interest in development, which goes back many decades. So, I hope that I can expand on that as we go along. I'll just, leave it there. But just to say that the main conclusion I draw is that, okay, we've got gold, we've got bauxite, we've got all of these resources, we've got many, hundreds of times what the resources of all our Caribbean countries combined. And yet we're so backward, and I think it has to do fundamentally with something you mentioned, Dr. Blackman, and that is our institutional setting. I mean, you mentioned a lot of other things and you touched on that, but I will put that at the top of my concern. How we've made mistakes for decades in terms of how we manage things. And if we identify these mistakes, it should be easy to solve them, or not easy, but still be solvable. And that's what
thank you. So I think maybe I'll begin maybe the more formal remarks from you with you, because I think that's where I wanted you to go, and I'm glad you mentioned this earlier period of being an economic advisor to the broad leadership of Guyana. So I wanted you to kind of give us a sketch of the economic legacy of post-independence Guyana, kind of a sense of our past policies and perhaps maybe governance, how these past policies and governance have shaped today, and then in a sense some of the lessons that we can learn and how they potentially can be implemented. So, give us, since I suppose you're the I don't want to say elder, but you have
Please
more.
Don't.
So lead us off. Give us a sense of this history that is bedeviling us.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's advantage in being an elder. One of the problems, just touching on this, one of the problems that we face in Guyana is a general sense that pervades the society that our problems are, cannot be solved. That where we are is, this is the best we can do, and that has to do with the fact that maybe 70% of the population or more has lived through a certain paradigm as a country, right? A country that where the best thing you could do is get away from it, migrate. And I think that one of the biggest challenges, and this is why a book like this is important, one of the biggest challenges is for people to be able to see what our problems are a little more closely and really try to tackle them. Now, so that's just a remark following on what you just said. But what's been very clear, as I mentioned before, is that for most of Guyana's post-independence period, the main thing we've experienced is economic underperformance. The country has not performed. A word like potential really gets me, gets under my skin, because we've heard it for so long and we just have not realized that potential. And as a matter of fact, in terms of the book, a number of the chapters you will see in this book touch on that problem of underperformance. Especially, I would mention specifically Dr. Delisle Worrell's paper that really chronicles, in a way, the period. He focuses on 1990 to now, but or to 2019. But you get a sense from that of the process of on the performance, and as you mentioned, some of the things you mentioned, the rise, the shift to a very big public sector oriented economy, and so on. So this underperformance is key. And one things that reflect, that show you that underperformance is not just, we could go by the figures, GDP per capita, etc., etc. But when you see the level of out-migration, migration tells you that the population is saying, this is not working, I've got to get somewhere else. And that record of high emigration and brain drain is a big indicator of what's happened and what continues to happen. The second thing, of course, is that for 60 or 70 years of our history since independence, since before independence, we've had this undercurrent of political instability. And it's hard. It's like swimming up, trying to swim upstream all the time, and because of this problem, and we have to address that problem. Dr. Worrell's paper highlights some of the figures that show, the low performance of the economy. He mentions the GDP in 1989 was about half what it was in 1980. And that is really a dramatic thing. And he pays attention to the Human Development Index, which is a way of judging the economy, not just by GDP, but also taking into account the health conditions and educational conditions. So that's a composite measure. And if you look at that measure too, you see the underperformance of the economy. And as you know, sugar has gone down. Rice has held steady for many years. But of course, and gold, of course, rose because of the price. The price of rice of gold just went up so much, and as a result of that, the interest in gold went up. The value of our exports went up, and of course, bauxite has been up and down over the years. But of course, as I said, the important thing to watch, which matters to us as people, is this migration issue, where the best option for our young people is to migrate, to go somewhere else and get to study, to raise your children, etc., etc. Now, the thing is, I'm going to, come to that in a bit, but the last 5 years have been the oil years, so to speak. I mean, you could say that really we've been in the oil economy for 10 years, because from the time that the oil was discovered, it transformed our options. It didn't have to come out of the ground yet, you see. But I would suggest that the last 5 years have reinforced our concerns about the dangers, the problems that we've had as a country with rich resources, and our inability to turn those resources into betterment for the people. We still have the same challenges, and we have to focus on them. Now, I'll just so that's a very broad picture, but I'll just add a couple of things that I think are worth mentioning. Dr. Worrell, I'm focusing on his paper deliberately because of the fact that he has this historical picture, which refers to your question. But of course, a lot of what he says is reflected. The other papers are equally interesting, but he touches on the informal sector. And to a certain extent, he touches on the informal sector pretty much from the income side. And interestingly enough, for example, when you talk about 60% GDP growth of Guyana because of the oil, part of the reason for that is the low starting point of GDP. As a mathematician, you would, I'm sure, appreciate what I'm saying, right? The economy was so small in 2015 that an output of oil was enough to create this large growth. I mean, so that is the problem with that is that it's created in the minds of the people, including the policymakers, this sense of that we have unlimited resources, which can be a mistake in terms of how you approach the management of the economy. But going back to the informal sector, I think that we need to find out a little bit more, pay more attention to what's going on you hear so much about problems of the dimensions of money laundering, and maybe we know that Guyana is a big transshipment point for large amounts of drugs. As a matter of fact, we know that because we find it by the tons when we dig it up. So these are aspects, and the work of this book should be seen as a beginning. It's not the end of the story, but research is something that goes on, and these are some of the things that we need to pay more attention to find out the details of. Now, the other quick thing I want to say is, out of all of the papers, and I would focus especially on the section that covered by Dr. Bollers, Tarron himself, myself, and Delisle. One common thread that comes through in all those papers independently is the importance of fiscal prudence. All right? All of those papers mention the need for fiscal prudence coming from different directions. And so, as we go forward as a country, these are the things, it's so important that we understand the importance of managing the resources, not just having them, managing these resources properly. And this idea that we can spend and spend and spend, it can be a mistake. The other part of it, and this is being highlighted by Tarron's paper, among others, is the danger of monetizing the deficit spending. In other words, money creation, printing money, which seems to have been a major problem, because with all these resources, everybody knows that it's still very difficult to get foreign exchange. How come, with all this money flowing, how is it that we have a problem of foreign exchange shortage? And that is connected, and that point has been made by Tarron, by my own paper, and so on, that this business of monetizing, I don't want to take, I'm sure Tarron will have more to say on this, but the issues of inflation and so on have to do with this. The final thing I would say is the government has focused on infrastructure, building, and so on. But I come back to my main point. We need to pay more attention as a country to building our institutions that build the sense of legitimacy of the government. And this is particularly urgent at a time not only when we need to raise poverty, eliminate poverty, but when we are faced with serious threats, military threats from outside of the country. We have to sort out our institutional and political and governance issues so that we can be united at a time like this. Thank you very much.
So, this is always a very tricky thing, but it's part of what we're aiming at doing, which is to link these technical aspects to the broader society. So, I think you framed it very nicely for Terrence's remarks. How do we affect the sort of compromises that make our institutions more transparent, that make us more unified internally, to deal with an external threat, to better manage our internal, better manage questions of migration. But these things all somehow, at least this is my, and perhaps this is this is a flaw in my thinking. They somehow always revolve around understanding kind of the technical dynamics, and so Tarron, I know your work is, covered helps us to understand as Desmond, sort of the nexus between like this fiscal monetary nexus and the broader society. And so, I want to invite you to speak to your thoughts on the work, the book, but then give yourself an opportunity to reign more freely on the larger question of Guyana's post-independence economics.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And thank you for having us to showcase this book. When we were putting together this idea, Dianna, Desmond, myself, we wanted to emphasize 2 points. And for observers, whether you are a journalist, whether you are a business owner, an entrepreneur, you are a major policymaker, we've got to think about the forces that are determining the short-term outcome in economic variables, right? If that is growth, inflation. Because those forces are fundamentally different than the ones that will determine the long-term trend of the variable, let's say GDP per capita, right? And for our purpose, we should not be thinking about GDP per capita in the aggregate. It should be the non-oil GDP divided by your population, right? So this is the way to judge the success of the economy. And it is true the non-oil sector is growing at a decent 10, 11% clip in recent years. So when we were putting together this book, we want to know what determines the GDP next year versus what determines the GDP 20 years from now. And as I said, so this is really one of the themes of the book. It's one of those unstated, implicit objective of the book. So you'll see some papers focusing on institutions, for example, Dr. DaCosta's paper, right, arguing that one of the reasons for the poor long-term outcomes in these human development index and so on that Dr. Thomas mentioned a few minutes ago, it was the institutional nature of the country. And by institutions, it means your legal system, the Constitution, because I know one of the things we should get straight here, in mainstream economics, right, there's very little role for constitutions, right? And we should keep this in mind, right? When we think of institutions, we're talking about laws that make it easy to do business and for the entrepreneur to keep his or her profit. It should not be expropriated, right? That's what institutions generally mean. But we want to take it beyond that. And this has been part of my writings, of course, going back the last 15 years, is the Constitution is a very important institutional mechanism. And this Constitution has implications for how economic resources will be shared over time. And these are long-term issues, right? So now, yes, the question of the fiscal and the monetization and so on, these are also very important. This explains why we have shortages of foreign exchange, or why people are saying we cannot find certain foreign exchange, risk paradox of plenty. Here we have the greatest amount, the country is earning the most foreign exchange it has ever earned in its entire history. But then several people are saying they have to wait in a queue for foreign exchange, right? So that is linked to the monetization issue, which from an economist we'll say that's a matter of stabilization. So when you hear we talk about the short term, we are thinking about what does it take to stabilize the economy, to keep it on a stable path. When we think of long term, what are the policies that will drive us to a high living standard over the long term? And a minimum condition for this high living standard, of course, will be the level of the average income, the non-oil income in the economy, right? Now, the question of history came up, and in particular, economic history came up very early in this discussion. And I would say, yes, we don't have a lot of studies on economic history in Guyana, and this book is not purely a book about economic history, but it sets that tone and it builds on previous works on our economic history. But there are some notable pieces. I mean, for me, one of the best pieces on Guyana's economic history is the History of the Guyanese Working People by Walter Rodney, right? So, and there have been a few. Myself, I've written a few papers on the economic history, right? Because I focus precisely on history. Economic history, not history. So the question then is, why have we underperformed? And then people might say, well, look, this economy is growing at 42%, or the IMF is giving us all these glowing reviews, right? Well, we have underperformed, and here is why. And I'll give you the short answer, and then I'll expand. The short answer is that we have not been able, going back to the 1700s, there's always been a shortage of internal capital, right? Let me restate that. There has been a shortage of internal capital, meaning the capital or the money, the savings, which are necessary to propel the kind of development we need, right? Now, so I started from 1750. I'm going to back up and come back here for the last 10 years. However, yes, we can argue, and I've written a lot on this. Please go on Starbucks News. You'll see all my columns there. I agree. The oil contract with ExxonMobil is not great. I agree. But it still gives Guyana, going to the government and the non-governmental sector, the indirect effect, it is the largest amounts of capital that this country has ever received going back to 1750. The largest amount of capital, right? So for the first time in Guyana's history, it has the chance to think carefully how to deploy this capital. We can argue we want more, sure, right? How to do it. And for us to understand how to do it, we have to go back to 1750 and work ourselves forward. Initially, if you read the accounts, like I've been going through some books that were published in 1880, 1870, and all the books that were written are bringing up this point of how difficult it is to do agriculture in Guyana, right? It's not easy to do agriculture. It's very costly, right? And so if you go back, you'll find that when Europeans establish cotton farms and coffee farms and these initial crops, right? They fail, and they fail often. And one of the reasons why they fail was there was no organizing body at the time to provide the drainage, right? The infrastructure, the public good, so that all you can do is sit down and plant and focus on your soil and your crop. You got to make sure you keep the water out from your neighbor farm coming to your farm, and this has been a challenge. And for the first time in Guyana's history, this challenge was starting to be addressed by King Sugar. Yes, we could say that the Europeans were exploitative. Yeah, we could use all those language, right? But for the very first time, the consolidation of the sugar industry in Guyana allowed to deal with this problem, right? And even by dealing with this problem, Guyana was still not competitive in producing sugar relative to Cuba, to Australia, to Mauritius and all these places, right? Going back in the late 1800s, still not competitive. The reason why sugar succeeded in Guyana was because of the preferential access and the lobbying power of the Bookers and those families in the legislature in England. That's the only reason, right? So one of the things that these people would have had to do was you suppress wages. You kept wages low, right? Exploitation is one of the ways, right? And so this infrastructure problem, which was given to us by nature, we didn't choose it. This is how the place is, right? It's swamp. The coastal plain of Guyana, please remember, 400 years ago, this was all swamplands, right? Right? It was a swamp. You had only a small number of Amerindian tribes figured out how to live on this swampland, right? Right? So the sugar industry dealt with it, right? So we fast forward now, and I have some data. I have a new paper we're doing, and I'll show in the paper that, and it has nothing to do with corruption. I know people like to bring in corruption and all of that, right? It's Guyana to produce a mile of road is the highest in the world, right? Unit cost to produce a mile of road, right? And so we have to start asking ourselves why. And if a mile of road is going to cost us so much money, are we building the road at the right place, right? So my short answer is Guyana has always had a shortage of internal capital. And for the first time we got some capital, how do we deploy it? What are the optimal ways to do this, right? Yes, I don't want to quit because IMF reports never impressed me. It never did. It never will. The writing is not good. The economists that they send down on the teams don't impress me, right? So because they cannot address these questions, right? Going back to 1750, all right? Let me burst some myth before I close. There is this constant myth in Guyana that somehow in 1965, 1970, Guyana was a richer country on average than Singapore. It's not true, right? I have the number here. In 1970, Singapore's per capita income was $925 US in 1970. In Guyana, that number was 592, right? Right. So Singapore has had a history as a port city for several hundred years, and developing from that were certain institutions of business. For example, they were able to master the writing of insurance. They were able to master shipping, right? Right. And this led to a certain embedded technologies and know-how that developed out of the culture, right? Right. Of this being this city-state on the waterfront, right? These are the broad questions, and I know we're getting deeply in these topics. If you want to compare Guyana, in 1970, Botswana's, which is a success story, right? Anybody will tell you Botswana is a success story. Botswana's average income was $96 US, which was way lower than Guyana, right? So Botswana was able to manage those natural resources way better, right, than we have done until now, right? And has now achieved a certain level of development. It's not a developed country, it has its problems, but if we want to compare, let's compare ourselves with Botswana, not Singapore, right? So all I'm saying is, so let us. How do we best utilize this capital we finally have, right? And the book really gets into some of these. It teases out some of these questions, and research is not a static endeavor. As Desmond said a few minutes ago, it's something that is continual, and we hope other people will now build on these ideas and build on this research, and should be writing journal articles, peer-reviewed articles, and peer-reviewed monographs, and so on. So I'll close out by saying, yes, before this book, there have been some important economic history books published. For example, in 1973, J. Mandel published a book, The Plantation Economy. 1973, it's over 50 years old book, right? It was purely on Guyana. I mentioned Rodney's book, which is a great, that should be required reading in all schools in Guyana, right? Rodney did not set out as economic historian, but for me, it's an economic history book, right? And then, of course, you have many articles on economic history that will show up in the paywall, but they're in JSTOR. You can access through university libraries. I'm sure at UG you can access JSTOR. Ralph Farley did works in the 1950s and published in social and economic studies that you can characterize as economic history. And we are building on those themes. To conclude, the book has two implicit objectives to tell us that we must think about what determines the GDP 5 years from now and what determines the GDP 20 years from now, the long term versus the short term, because they're very different. Whenever you read an IMF report, the IMF is always telling you about what's going to happen 3-4 years down the road, right? That's their focus, that's their horizon. And that's fine, because when you enter into an IMF program or you're part of the Article 4, their whole purpose, the mandate of the IMF is stabilization, right? It's about make sure the economy is on a stable path, right? And so there are some, but what are the long term? Now, in terms of policies that I see on the ground today, look, the government is right to focus on diversification. I think there has been some successes there in alternative crops. We can say that we should be farther, but I always say, where's the internal capital? Who's going to bring up the internal capital? In closing, though, here is one of the greatest failures in economic policy since 1988. One of the greatest failure of economic policy is not to build on the infrastructure of Gaisuku, which produces this private good called sugar, but it also produced a public good called drainage. We never appreciate the fact that Gaisuku was always the organization causing villages to have less floods, right? Growing up, right? So, but by shutting down the sugar industry and not starting the diversification from around 1998, 88, 98, where, okay, we understand our soil types, we understand the way we have to lay out our beds, we understand this is our drainage system. What are the crops that best suit? Gaisuku had engineers, Gaisuku had agronomists, Gaisuku had scientists in-house. You have marketing people in-house. And by shutting and destroying the industry, you are destroying know-how. This is what propels economies, right? It's know-how, right? What is technology? Technology is know-how. Technology is not the gadget smartphone. That's not a technology. Technology is the knowledge you have to use the resources you have to make something. And by shutting down Gaisuku and continue to focus on sugarcane and not figuring out, should it have been breadfruit? Should Gaisuku be producing bamboo plantations, which will now be used for making furniture, right? What are these crops? Coconut plantations? Were these the way to go? I don't know the answer, but I can tell you at the time you had people inside Gaisuku who could have figured those things out. You don't anymore. And that is the biggest policy failure going back to 1988. And I'll stop there.
Tarron, thank you so much. That's I'm glad you ended on this Gaisuku. This is a view that I share. And as you were talking, I was reminded that, in I think 2021, I wrote this little piece called "Sugar, Renewable Energy, and the Exxon Windfall," It was carried in some of the opinion pages and commentary pages across the Caribbean. And essentially, I sort of made, an argument like you just made, which was that, we produced sugar for 15 generations. I think if I remember my facts correctly, the first cultivation of sugar in Guyana is like maybe 1650s, right? So we start planting commercially in the 1700s. 100 years to the point you were making. We were not the most competitive people. We were late to the sugar game. We came in the 1700s, perhaps 100 years after folks our counterparts in the West Indies, and so because of the fact that we entered late, we imported relatively advanced milling sugarcane equipment. This advanced equipment, in a sense, gave us a more secure foundation, kind of made our sugar economy a kind of a little better. And the point you just made is one which I think bears repeating for policymakers who are listening. Gaisuco was the country's largest cultivator and producer of sugar, 10 to 15% of Guyana's annual revenue. The infrastructure of Gaisuco, the point that you just made, was, I think, the thing that we did not curate in an effective manner. And it's unfortunate that we, when we recognize that as currently configured, it was economically unsustainable and all of the things that went with that, I think what we needed to do was to recognize that that was the platform on which we needed to pivot. Gaisuco was the platform on which to pivot Gaisuco. And somehow we didn't, even now, I think this thing, I'm sorry, you sent me on a little rant that I've kept for a long time. And since you called it the worst decision, I want to not agree. I'm not going to characterize bad or worse, but I do think that it is a decision that if looking back, if we had the opportunity, we would have done the unwinding of Gaisuco in the sugar side, and my argument was that we needed to re-up Gaisuco in the energy side, because that was a place where we had expertise and infrastructure and real industrial capacity. And when you take that away, it's very, very difficult to rebuild that. So I think that's a very good point, and it leads me into Diana's kind of contribution to this. Tarron makes the following point. There are a couple of things. We have the shortage of internal capital. We need to do two things. We need to think about how to manage the short-term GDP, inflation, sort of tight fiscal monetary policy, etc. And we need to be thinking about how we also manage the long-term GDP. We need to be mindful, this point about Gaisuco, on the platform on which we're standing. And so I want you to speak to your contributions in the book, but also to kind of be the person, since I'm taking a, which perhaps might not be a politically correct, I'm being the youngest person on the panel. I want to give you the opportunity to be our person who looks out to the future. And so the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you want me to reflect on the present while also being futuristic?
Being futuristic. You're the young person. You will live in it longer than we will.
All right, but before I give my outlook of the future, I want to actually go back to the past a little.
I hope.
One section of the book focuses on the open economy. And throughout our economic history, we have been a highly open economy, very dependent as a peripheral nation on economic centers in the West, the United States because of proximity and our trade relations, and the United Kingdom and the European Union generally because of our historical political ties through colonialism. So the external economy has always played a very significant role in our economic performance. In fact, when you started the session, you spoke about our economic downturn during the 70s and 80s, which you linked to socialist policies. But the wide economic environment, the global economic environment also played a role You'd recall during the 70s, there was an oil price shock.
Yeah.
And that fed into our economy and sort of depressed the manufacturing exploits that we were then trying to achieve or to attempt. But the point I want to make generally is the role exogenous shocks generally tend to play in how we are able to advance as an economy. Apart from that, the 1970s, we also have the US housing crisis during the 80s. And to build on a point Tarron made regarding the sugar industry, we had the reform of the Common Agricultural Program in the European Union around 2005, 2004, thereabout, that led to a substantial contraction in sugar exports, which, as you would know, was our leading export commodity during the 1990s, accounting for about 25% of our export earnings. So the fact that we're a small open economy has always played a role in how we're able to navigate our economic growth and development. And so for me, as a trade economist, I think a very critical consideration, notwithstanding the increased wealth coming from oil, is how do we build a more resilient economy? How do we move forward? Oil, as you know, is bringing in about 80% now of our export earnings. Prior to oil, in the latter part of the 90s, it was gold that was bringing in about 51% of our export earnings. And the challenge we had with that is that while this key export commodity was bringing in a lot of export revenues, we had not really transformed the sector. We had not moved up value chains. We had not expanded into value-added activities. We continued exportation of a primary commodity, which, as you know, comes with decline in terms of trade. So here we are in the oil era, and we have a new primary commodity, a new kid on the block, and it's a primary commodity. And we want to be able to move past the point of being dependent on primary commodities and avoiding the challenges that come with over-reliance on export commodities, particularly where they are unprocessed. So for me, the concern is how do we build an economic system that is resilient, that is able to achieve structural transformation away from significant reliance on exportation of primary commodities. Oil and gas is a finite resource. At some point, it's going to deplete. So we need to manage our economic transformation so that we are able to move beyond oil. I heard an economist from London School of Economics actually say not so long ago that the true test of your ability to transform, to achieve structural transformation, is to really push your non-oil sectors. So how do we then move to a point where we are building our non-oil export sectors? I think that is very critical to help our economy to be resilient to any exogenous shock, to help our economy diversify into productive activities away from oil and gas. Agriculture, as you would know, contributed about 25% of our GDP, just contracted. That may not be a relative contraction, although it could possibly be an absolute contraction, that is. But when we look at contraction of the sugar industry, it could very well be an absolute contraction. But for the most part, it's a relative contraction because we have a new kid on the block with respect to economic output, which is the oil and gas sector. But the point still remains that agriculture has contracted, now only contributing about 11% of GDP. To really achieve diversification and to avoid Dutch disease, because we know other sectors, everybody's going to be looking at oil and gas. That's where the investments are being directed. So it calls for careful and proactive policy planning to ensure that the other sectors receive the sort of support that they need to grow. So for agriculture, we will need to concentrate on building productivity. And therefore, very critical going forward is having the policy capacity to ensure that we can really transform and push growth and development in the non-oil sector. And in spatial terms, that growth would also have to be equitable. I think of Bartica as the gateway into the hinterland region and its proximity to all of the mineral wealth and resources that have really led our transformation. And the fact that the level of development in those communities from which our natural resources are really coming from has not been consistent with the sort of export revenues that we get from exporting those commodities, which speaks to the fact that we are not plugging in back financial resources into the development of those communities. And addressing that requires careful policy planning. Now, in the section of the book that deals with the open economy, there are a number of issues that are examined, a number of policy proposals that are made. The article by Arjun and Lucky, for instance, they explore the wider multilateral environment, and Guyana's provide an historical overview of Guyana's trade patterns, but they also explore opportunities in services trade. Part of building our resilience in the international economy is also being able to navigate our policy space effectively. And that requires having a trade strategy that guides trade policymakers, that says what are our offensive interests as we engage bilateral partners, as we determine our commitments multilaterally. How do we take advantage of opportunities in global value chains? Apart from the rum industry, we have not really had a value-added activity that has really been able to succeed, move up global value chains and succeed internationally. Rum is really the only success story. But Arjun and Lucky also speak to the issue of services, the opportunities in services trade. When we look at our trade policy structure, much of the discussion is dedicated towards trade in primary commodities. And I've already spoken to the challenges associated with reliance and exportation of primary commodities. But how do we shift our policy architecture towards a focus on services where there are opportunities? And there are other things that are examined in that section of the book. Jacobs, for instance, looks at the issue of migration. As you would know, we've had one of the highest rates of outward flow of people, with migration of tertiary graduates reaching up to about 86% just about a decade ago. How do we then navigate our economic development? Because one of the critical needs that we do have is a need for human resources. So as much as there might be xenophobic talk around the Venezuelans and other nationalities that are coming in, the fact is we need people to develop, right? We need people in terms of skilled capital resources, but we also need people in terms of numbers. So how do we manage migratory flows? How do we deal with the fact that we now need to have an influx of people to support our development? And Mandel also looks at managing the migration shock associated with the inward movement of Venezuelans, and the fact that, on a wider scale, we would need to look as a country, how do we move people away from the coastal plain towards, hinterland regions where the susceptibility to flooding, etc., is reduced. And Williams considers the issue of remittances and how that could be used for investment in capital, in human capital. But there are wider discussions beyond the role the diaspora can play. Remittances has traditionally been a very important route that they've supported our national development, but there are newer areas that could be focused on. How do we tap into brain circulation? People may not necessarily want to return to Guyana, but how do we tap into the diaspora through volunteerism, for instance? So philanthropy is actually a very important avenue through which you can tap into your diaspora to support your national development. So that's an important area where future research can concentrate. And then, of course, Siratan looks at financial regulation, and Munsami and Oyedeton speak to managing the environment and dealing with environmental shocks. But going back to my point about building a resilient economy that is strong, that can withstand exogenous shocks, that reduces reliance on primary commodities, I think very critical to that is good policymaking. And good policymaking requires very strong public institutions. Now, traditionally, we've not been able to really build the sort of capacity needed in our public institutions to support growth. And theoretically, there's a discussion as to what is really the direction of the impact of institutions on our growth. Is it that we need strong institutions first before we're able to achieve economic transformation and development? Or is it the other way around, where we need the growth first and then we can transform the institutions? And for the most part, the consensus is that it's the latter. The economic wealth provides the opportunities for us to really transform the institutions. And when we look at the economic historical experiences of the developed world, they actually achieved growth first and then were able to really invest significantly in a lot of the institutions that have helped them to sustain and further transform growth. And that's what we need to look at. How do we use our available wealth to really push institutional transformation? How do we invest appropriately in our human capital resources through spending on education, through spending on health, because there's still a very significant and urgent need to really invest substantially in those areas so that we can really create the foundation needed for growth, which is strong human capital resources. So a very important consideration going forward is using the wealth that we have to invest in building our policy-making capacity, right? Ensuring that our institutions are strong so that we can have transparency, we can have accountability, right? As I said before, one of the reasons we've not really been able to grow is because we've not really been able to invest in our institutions. Because truth be told, institutions require money, right? Now that we have the financial means, it means that we can redirect our efforts, redouble our efforts towards building our institutional capacity so that the growth that we need to really build a strong and resilient economy going forward could be supported by strong institutions at all levels and in all areas of our economy. And that would be my response to the question that you raised regarding role of institutions, etc.
No, thank you very much. That is a very I have the title for wrapping up this program. Rum is our only success story. It's kind of many levels on which this works. You know, you raise a very, very important point. And I think this question of, developing high value added industries within the context of Guyana. And so our only case study that you point out is the rum, and this is true. I mean, I have to say, this is not an advertisement for the El Dorado company, but I have been able to find the El Dorado rum in Berkeley, California, in Denver, Colorado, in Johannesburg, South Africa,
Las Vegas.
You pick a place in the world, they have been able to do it. And so that's maybe the question I wanted to start the panel on. There've been a tremendous amount of questions that have come in. For you in particular, Dianna, economic history of Switzerland, institutional reforms in 1848 that laid the basis for strong economic growth. But I wanted to start with a question that connects both you and Desmond. So Desmond is sort of in his remarks made sort of clear that he felt these institutional things were super important. I think what you've just opened up the door a bit is to say institutions are important, but in order to build institutions, you have to have some, you said, you want to use wealth to build your policy making and institutional capacity. So how do you square this circle kind of going forward? Where's our emphasis? How do How do we get that done? Any one of you can start. I was going. You're muted, Desmond.
Okay, I was reflecting on the same question, and I think in a way we don't have a problem because, we have to start from where we are, and the point is that whether it was institutions first or development first, the fact of the matter is that we are at a point where we have an increase in resources available to the government. This is the first government in our history that has money, to spend, and therefore, well, on the scale that we're talking about anyway. And therefore, if I follow Dianna's reasoning, then we need right now to pay attention to our institutional development. That's where we are right now. We are in a position where we can. And it bothers me that there is such a glaring attempt by, there really is not the kind of focus and attention by the political people to the importance of fixing our institutions. And one of the things is, you find that the political parties tend to favor reform when they are in the opposition, right? But right now it bothers me that even the opposition doesn't seem to be giving this the attention and the focus that it deserves. So, I think, whatever the position is, we are at a position now where it is really important to address this. And, institutional reform, the reform of our elections, our governance, and so on, these things happen in the world all the time. That's why I said one of the problems we have as a country is where people don't seem to think we can do any better. Let me be, I'll say this for the university. I am disappointed that my university I went to seems not to be paying enough attention to, integrating this into the education of the students, the interest in how we manage the country. You can produce engineers and you can produce doctors and you can produce what you're doing instead of producing people who you're giving the tools to manage the economy, to manage the country. You're creating tools for other people to manage. That's how I see it. So anyway, that is. But I think the other thing that I'm connecting to something that something as Dianna mentioned, we need to pay more attention in the country to genuine decentralization. The fact that most of the during the gold period, it was output from region 8 and region 7 that was carrying the country. And at the same time, this was where the most poverty was. So all of that, these are the reasons why we need to have we need to focus more on how we work together as a people, and it can be done, and there are lots of details about this, what needs to be done, but that decentralization on the sugar thing, whatever the problem is, we have a problem with managing our resources, solving our problems. Nothing demonstrates that more than the sugar problem. For decades, I'm not going to suggest what's the solution here. But the fact of the matter is, I am convinced that there is a better solution. For example, this business of I'm glad the point about the integration between sugar production and the infrastructure, drainage, and so on has come up. That is part of solving the problem. How we, because the cost of drainage shouldn't be on the balance sheet of the sugar industry. How do you expect to be competitive when that is going on? So we have solutions, and this is the most frustrating thing about where we are in this country right now, is this sense that this is the best we can do. No, it's not. We need to do something about that.
Tarron, you're muted.
I had a quick intervention.
Go ahead, Dianna, and then Tarron will come in.
Yeah, in response to your question, I wanted to say there are two pathways. Better institutions require proactivity. It requires deliberate intervention towards shoring up the capacity of your institutions. But there's also an indirect route driven by the market. As economies grow, as they achieve wealth, you're going to have increased demands from the bottom up, from market players, from businesses, from non-governmental organizations. They're going to demand better quality institutions, and policymakers are going to have to respond. You're going to also have new agents of change in your economy. People seeking to drive innovation and recognizing that there are institutional gaps, they're going to lobby and push for those changes to be implemented. So while it requires a deliberate intervention by policymakers, the fact that you're able to achieve growth, a very high level of growth, the market is also going to drive the sort of institutional response needed to ensure that it can continue to thrive. I just wanted to add that as well. Thank you.
That's a very important point, and I think we're beginning to see some of that. Go ahead, Tarron.
Yeah, this has been a long discussion, decades discussion of where institutions come from, right? And I just want to reiterate, I think I mentioned this earlier, institutions means your legal framework that are conducive to market and business activities, right? That's the conventional wisdom. I think from a Guyana standpoint, we should expand that to include state capacity as an institution. This is why I like what Dianna said. You see, I am not in the camp that thinks that the government can't do anything good. As a matter of fact, I think the United States right now, all this DOGE effort is going to harm the US so much by destroying scientific in-house capacity that will have decades consequences for this country, right? And what the Trump people are doing right now is that should not be a model for Guyana, right? I mean, we need a country like Guyana needs state capacity because of the environmental, the ecological challenges that we face. The fact that 90% of the population lives below the sea level, right? At high tide. So these require certain technical competences that cannot be in the private sector, because the private sector, we learned going back to you mentioned 1600s, from the 1700s, we're not involved in solving drainage problems. These are stuff that governments do, right? Right. So where institutions come from? Institutions come from, they develop organically. You sometimes have elite consensus, where some places are just lucky. In the case of the United States, at its founding, where you had a group of enlightened men, all of them basically had liberal arts educations, by the way. They weren't engineers and doctors. They basically had classics, some algebra. They had liberal arts education. All the founding fathers were not medical doctors, right, or dentists. They had liberal arts education. And so a bunch of enlightened men and women happened to exist around the same time. They had a grouse with the British, and so they formed a new country. Yes, it was not inclusive. It was not meant for everybody from the beginning. Yes, we get that, right? But over time, through struggle, the US became more inclusive. However, so the US situations where these institutions form and then it led to market interventions, right? But even those, the success of the Constitution and the founding of the country, the U.S. remained an agrarian society, right? From 1776 up until the Civil War. It's not until after the Civil War the U.S. industrialized, right? Okay, and there was lots of government intervention in the economy along with private enterprise that allowed the U.S. to succeed, all right? So, and of course, the U.S. is blessed with one thing we don't have in Guyana: vast amounts of arable lands, natural ports, the fact that you're not going to be invaded by neighbors, you have two friendly people you can bully both to your south and your north, weaker countries, then you're protected by the oceans. We don't have those luxuries, right? So hence we need more institutional capacity in the government. You need the best people to come through the political parties, right? So we like to blame the government, but we're not blaming these two dominant political parties that dominated our lives going back to 1954, right? Let's ask the question: have they allowed the best talent to percolate to the top, right? Absolutely best talent to percolate to the top. Do we have the Constitution and the electoral system and the legal framework and the incentive structure such that you would have the absolutely most talented person, men and women, rising to the top? Okay. So institutions basically can evolve out of good luck. And then, like the case of the United States, I think it was luck, just a bunch of luck in 1776 and before. Institutions develop because of the right environment for people to come settle long term. This is the point Asimoglu and his co-authors made. Okay, that these institutions develop because we figure, oh, this land, this soil type, this geography is very similar to what we are living in Europe. We can have vast amounts of lands. Let's stay here for the long term. It's still our interest to set up good legal systems, to not have a dictator, and so on. Then bad institutions develop in places where you have extractive situations, where Europeans were not planning to live long term, right? They were basically, okay, we'll send some managers in, we'll take as much resource we can take out, and that's it. So there was no incentive to set up these lasting legal frameworks and constitutional mechanisms and so on, or to build state capacity, government capacity, right? And so institutions develop because people have an elite consensus. It develops because of the right conditions to settle. It develops because of luck. And so actually, I published a paper on this with Colin Constantine, and it's this paper if anyone wants to read it, right? It's online. You can download it for free, right? It's called Geography, Economic Structures and Institutions, a Synthesis, right? So so in closing, while it is true that institutions matter, we have to ask ourselves where institutions come from. Because as an economist, we think institution itself is not exogenous. Institution is endogenous to the political struggles and the production structure of the time. And that's the conclusion of our paper.
Yeah, thank you. So this has been it's amazing. We're already at 2 minutes before noon. So we've rapidly gotten to the end without even thinking that we've gotten to the end.
Maybe we can spend another 30 minutes if people have the time.
No. So you see, I have to run off.
All right.
Yeah. But I wanted, this has been, I wanted to kind of close and give you each a chance to respond. I think Diana's sort of question, like, how do we build a more resilient economy? And, how do we move up the value chain? And there are two issues that emerge in this discussion that I think are really important. The one that you've just been describing, Tarron, around the question of the institutions that mediate our society. And then the second question that kind of emerges is, in some very concrete way, this non-oil economy. So we have this massive 80-90% of money that flows to us from the oil and gas sector. But then what really, for the question that you framed, we want to look near term, what's good for the GDP tomorrow, But then what's good for the GDP when it's all gone 20 years from now? And I want you guys to somehow reflect on those aspects. How do we get the policy making right so that we make the good decisions with Suco, we make the good decisions with gold, we make the good decisions with now this oil and gas sector, we make the good decisions relative to investing in the agriculture, in the non-oil, and in particular the agriculture sector. How do we do that? What's your, and I'll give Dianna the last word. So we'll go in reverse order this time. Dr. Desmond Thomas, you will get the first closing word. Then we'll come to Tarron, and you will get the last word, in part because you're the youngest, and you get to look further into the future than we do. You're muted, Dr. Thomas.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we really ran out of time, and the fact of the matter is that Guyana, we face problems that it will take many discussions like this one to address them. And I'm happy that you've given us this opportunity at this stage to even touch on some of these things. But really and truly, I feel the urgency for us to address the problems that we have, and we have the resources. We have the. This is an election year, incidentally.
Oh, we didn't mention that at all, right?
Yeah, and so in that context, the elections are the way the population is given a decision chance in a democracy, the chance to participate actively in the thing.
Maybe just to cut you, I mean, one of the things, and I'm glad that we didn't mention this, so there's a comment from David Modeste, and I noted it. This question about growth and elections, and maybe it's a point for us to emphasize here that, in the framing you guys have, near term, long term, we need to do some things for long-term GDP growth. We need to do some things for near-term GDP growth. And in terms of our elections, these near-term cycles kind of drive us in the wrong direction. And maybe as part of the reflection that you close with is around this particular aspect where we think about how we have continuity across political cycles, because this seems to be one of those things where our decision making is off. One person comes in, everything goes out. The next person comes in, and there's no sense of this long cycle that you guys have been articulating here today.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
sure,
you
get the last word.
The key thing about that is to understand this. Guyanese people as a whole, across all parties, I think we can agree on what we want as a people. It's the political situation that creates these problems. We as a people, and there have been key moments when we agree on certain things that other people have problems with. So that continuity is broken up. Part of our problem is that we are hostage to this two-party paradigm. As a hostage. Once we're in that, it's difficult to have the things you're talking about, that continuity of policy, that strength of the public sector, of the non-political part, and so on, so on. So these are the things that need to be addressed, and we need to do it now. We need to do it now. This is the chance, not to wait or hope that something is going to happen from the bottom up or whatever, because that is not how things work. The United States, the brilliant thing, Terrence, I'm happy you brought this up. The Constitution of the United States is something that is widely understood to have been a fundamental and powerful part of creating the country that they have. All right, and that's we need to especially where we're part of the policy making environment. This is the kind of thing we need to address. How we fix because the people in the country are not satisfied with our existing governance and other things. Nobody's satisfied. People are migrating. People are saying how the inflation is hurting them. This, that, that. That's what you're hearing. Billions of dollars in oil, and yet that's what you're still hearing. So these are the things we have to fix. Thank you very much. Thank you so much to you and to my colleagues and to all the listeners.
Tarron, you get the closing remarks.
Yeah, I'm glad. David Modest raised this point of the continuity of policy, and that's exactly one of the things you need. However, the current framework we have, the current constitution, the current electoral system, they do not allow for that consensus building. It's a competitive system. It promotes competition, right? So, so you have to outdo your other side with promises, okay, for the election cycle. So I'm going to give you a big cash handout. The other side, I'm going to give you a bigger handout. So, and then of course, it's not really funded as we know. I mean, Colin Constantine and myself have written about this. We have paper on this. We have proof of this. It's not funded by the oil funds. It's you monetize it, right? I mean, you if you want to quickly hand out $82 billion, it's really the central bank creates the money, which is then deposited government account. It's just spent to people, right? Which are done given to people as checks. So, but what you really need is this agreement, this broad agreement on some themes, and that now you work towards that for the long term, okay? And you have to deflate expectations of the population, and it can't be done by one party. It has to be done by both. Listen, this oil thing is great, but it's going to take some time. We need some time, all right? So what political scientists call forbearance. You need some level of forbearance, but our current setup is not going to allow that. And this is not unique to Guyana, because it's exactly the same problem we're talking about of trying to outcompete each other at election by making huge promises and then monetizing those promises. Exactly the same thing happens in Ghana, right? So it's not unique. So I can't leave you on a more optimistic.
Yes. Try to go for optimism.
I tell you that that it is absolutely that is the key. How do we get the political divide to think about some big goals and have joint ownership of this big goal? We're not talking about power sharing, We're talking about big goals. And let us agree, let us top down expectations and work towards these goals. That would be great for 20, 30 years into the future.
So Dianna, you get the last word from the panelists. Big goals, but building a resilient society, being there in the long term. Give us your closing thoughts.
Thank you. Before I give my vision of what I think Guyana can achieve in the future, I want to reflect briefly on the Hausman-Roderick framework of self-discovery. This comes from two Harvard economists, Danny Roderick and Ricardo Hausman, and they basically said that the key aspect of transforming an economy, a modern economy, is learning what you are good at producing. And our resources more or less indicate what we're good at producing, right? But to really transform your resources into value-added products and create the sort of diversification that can help build a resilient economy, it calls for exploration, it calls for creativity, and it calls for innovation, so that we can spark new entrepreneurial ideas, development of new products from which investment ideas and patterns of export specialization could emerge. And the way to achieve that is to invest in youth and education. Investing in our youth and in our educational system, which is another way of investing in your youth, will ensure that you create the human capacity that could really drive the sort of innovation that would help us leapfrog into new opportunities for production, new opportunities for value-added products, position us to be able to explore new markets. And I'm thinking of the youth in a transnational lens, right? Countries such as India, China, Rwanda, Ghana, they've all approached their definition of youth from a policy perspective through a transnational lens. In other words, your diaspora abroad have a critical role to play, even though they may be second and third generation descendants of Guyanese. Yes. They are still Guyanese and they can still contribute to the country's development. So if we view youth through that wider lens, we can also consider ways that we can tap into our diaspora who can see technological gaps and opportunities, market opportunities, because they've existed in another cultural context. They can also bring in innovative ideas that will help us create the transformation that we need to really build a resilient economy. So I see Guyana having a very vibrant and bright future, but I think we're going to get there faster, and we're going to achieve resilience, and we're going to achieve diversification and help to build a non-oil sector if we invest in education and if we invest in our youth, so that we create the foundation and the platform from which new entrepreneurial and innovative ideas could emerge and spark to take our economy forward. In other words, we really have to just create an environment that gives way to the youth. And that would be my submission of what I think is needed to really transform the economy.
Well, I didn't thank you very much. I didn't plan. I hope this program would reflect a path that kind of created an environment that really, is focused on transferring the society to the youth. I want to thank all three of you for really doing a wonderful job. We've gone over by a couple of minutes, so I'll be a little late for my next, but that's okay. But I wanted to say thank you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I think you've given me some real you've given me some real clarity in terms of my own thinking. Building institutions that mediate the society. Developing a robust non-oil economy. Making good decisions. How do we get us to make good decisions? How do we look at the lessons from managing the resources in the past, gold, sugar, bauxite, etc.? How do we invest strategically in the current oil sector so that we're, this rum is our only success story, I think is something. We need to have something else that is value added, that emerges from this oil and gas sector that we haven't even seen the emergence of just yet. And I think the last 2 points I want to frame that I think you've made really clearly, the idea of the short-term GDP and the long-term economic sustainability, the continuity across the political cycles, and then the point you just drove home for us, the investing in human capital and institutional capacity, and not excluding the diaspora. And so, on that note, I just really want to say again, thank you, folks in the audience. I want to encourage the continued conversation beyond this. I want to encourage everyone to get the book and read it. And I look forward to seeing you in January, February, March, in April's version of the GBJ conversation. So, colleagues, thank you very much. Have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, and I look forward to further conversations as we go forward.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.